Harold Bennett folded each piece of tissue paper with the same precision he once used to fold his uniform. At 76, the bones in his hands clicked and protested, but his movements remained steady. He had performed this quiet ritual every Christmas Eve for the past 15 years. Each toy was wrapped gently and tucked into a weathered leather bag that bore the marks of age and use, scuffs from gravel roads, stitches added by hand where the seams had split, a burn mark from an old fireplace in his former home. The bag was older than some of the children it now served, but to Harold, it carried more than just gifts, it carried memory. The living room around him was modest. A wood stove murmured in the corner, and a single strand of lights framed the window, though only half still glowed. On the mantel sat a photograph of a boy in uniform. His name tag read Jason Bennett. He was smiling, sun in his eyes, one arm thrown casually over the shoulder of another soldier. Behind them, a stretch of tan desert glared under the camera's flash. Jason had been Harold's only grandson, and he had died during his third tour in Iraq. That Christmas, the first without him, Harold had wandered into St. Clair's shelter on the edge of Bloomwood with a trunk full of Jason's unopened toys. The staff thought he was a donor. In truth, he had simply needed somewhere to place his grief. And so it began. Every year since, he had returned to the shelter with a fresh bag of toys, always on Christmas Eve, always at night, and always without announcement. He never stayed long. A brief visit, a few smiles, and then he would leave before anyone could make a fuss. It wasn't about recognition. It was about remembering. That year, the storm came early and with a quiet vengeance. The forecast had warned of snow, but no one expected the speed or severity of it. By mid-afternoon, flakes were already falling fast, thickening by the hour. By sunset, Bloomwood lay beneath a white silence, and the plow struggled to keep the roads open. Emergency alerts blinked on phones and televisions, urging residents to stay indoors. But Harold had packed the bag the night before, as always. He'd gone over his checklist, adding 2 more trucks for the DS twins and a soft bear for the new girl who'd arrived last week. He knew their names, though he'd never spoken them aloud. The staff sometimes posted updates on the shelter's bulletin board, and Harold had made a habit of walking by in the early mornings to read them. He liked to know who he was giving to. It made it real. As the wind howled and the town dimmed beneath its icy weight, Harold layered up, thermal undershirt, long wool coat, cap pulled low, gloves tight around aching fingers. He slipped Jason's photo into his coat pocket, next to a folded note Jason had once written him during boot camp. Then he hoisted the bag into the back of his old SUV, started the engine, and pointed it toward St. Clair. The tires skidded more than once, and twice he considered turning back, but the thought passed as quickly as it came. 2 blocks from the shelter, the road became impassable. The snow had drifted so high it swallowed the tires. Harold shifted into reverse, then drive, then reverse again, but the vehicle refused to move. The engine groaned and then gave up. Harold sat in silence for a moment, the soft rattle of snow against the windshield like fingers tapping to test his resolve. He shut off the ignition, pulled the key, and stepped out. The wind caught his breath immediately, stealing it from his lungs. He leaned into it, adjusted the bag over his shoulder, and began to walk. The bag was heavier this year. His shoulder ached, the old injury from Vietnam flaring up with every step. But he kept moving. Each block seemed longer than the last. The snow came sideways, biting into his face and neck. His boots broke the crusted surface and sank deep, every step a battle. By the time he reached the shelter, his coat was stiff with frost. He stood by the door, catching his breath. Light spilled from inside, warm, golden light that promised safety and cheer. Children's laughter echoed faintly through the walls. But Harold did not knock. He never did. Someone always noticed him eventually. He stood beneath the awning, snow collecting in the folds of his cap, his boots forming small islands in the drifts. Inside, a new security guard watched from a distance. He was young, unfamiliar with the faces of the town. The holiday had brought an extra staff, and names had not yet been passed along. To the guard, Harold looked like a vagrant, an older man, alone, with a heavy bag and no clear purpose. The streets were empty. The curfew advisory had cleared them of all but emergency responders. And yet, here was this man, unmoving, silent, carrying something large and waiting in the dark. The guard's training nudged him toward caution. He picked up the phone and made a call. Somewhere nearby, Officer Zach Harris was nearing the end of his shift. A recent transfer from Chicago, he had volunteered to work Christmas Eve. He was still learning the rhythms of small-town law enforcement, where the calls were few but the community watched everything. His cruiser moved slowly through the snow-covered streets until the dispatch came through, suspicious person reported near St. Clair Shelter. When he arrived, Harold was still standing in place. The snow had gathered around his boots like a sculptor building a monument. Officer Harris parked and approached quickly. He asked no questions. His instincts were sharp, but his understanding dulled by unfamiliarity. To him, Harold's silence seemed evasive. The bag, heavy and concealed, raised concern. The refusal to leave, despite warnings, was taken as defiance. Within minutes, the scene shifted. Harold's arm was twisted behind him, his balance lost as the handcuffs closed around his wrists. He did not resist, but his face, contorted in pain, bore the quiet shame of being misunderstood. The bag tipped into the snow, spilling a truck, a doll, and a box of crayons into the white. From across the street, under the overhang of a closed storefront, a teenage boy watched from the shadows. His phone was already in his hand. He hit record without thinking, just instinct, the way some things demand to be witnessed. The lens caught the trembling of Harold's knees, the rough grip of the officer's hands, the quiet dignity of a man who had chosen not to shout. The snow kept falling. And the camera kept filming. A story was already beginning to write itself, one that no one yet knew they were part of. The video was uploaded just before midnight. The boy who filmed it added no dramatic text, no edits, no music, just a simple caption written in lowercase, "Veteran delivering toys arrested in the snow." Is this what safety looks like? It spread faster than anyone expected. By morning, the footage had reached every corner of the internet. First it caught traction on TikTok, then Instagram, and soon it appeared on local news feeds, followed by national ones. The starkness of the video, the frailty of the man, the silent fall of snow, the bright toys scattered against the white, the officer's firm grip, told a story louder than words. Viewers were outraged. The post was shared with hashtags like #HonorOurVets and #ChristmasEveArrest. Comment sections filled with disbelief and sorrow. Some wrote from anger. Others wrote from guilt. But most wrote because they recognized something sacred had been violated, a quiet act of kindness misread, restrained, and erased. At the Bloomwood precinct, Harold sat alone in a small holding cell. The bench was cold, the walls pale green, the air buzzing with the hum of fluorescent light. His shoulder, long damaged from a training accident decades ago, had been wrenched again in the snow. He said nothing about the pain. His silence came not from stubbornness but from exhaustion, the kind born from years of being unseen. The officer at the front desk reviewed Harold's ID, military tags, and the absence of any criminal record. His fingers hovered above the keyboard, unsure of what charge to input. There had been no threat, no P*N, no resistance, just a misunderstanding, now bloated into consequence. A sergeant made a quiet call to the arresting officer, asking for clarity. The response was uncertain. Harris had meant well, he said. He was following procedure, he said. But when asked why he hadn't spoken more than 2 sentences to the man before applying force, he didn't answer. At dawn, Harold was released without charges, without questions, and without apology. No officer helped him with the door. No one offered a ride. He stepped back into the snow-covered street alone. The bag had been returned to him, the toys repacked with less care than he had given them. Some were broken. The ribbon around the bear's neck had fallen loose. Harold didn't fix it. He simply walked. Each step home felt heavier than the last. The snow had stopped, but the air still carried the echo of his arrest, the bark of command, the scrape of boots, the click of steel cuffs. His legs trembled, not from the cold, but from the memory. At the age when most are cared for, Harold carried the burden of being misunderstood. He arrived at his house before the world fully woke. But his street was not quiet. News vans had lined the curb in silence, like witnesses waiting to testify. Microphones waited like drawn swords, reporters hushed in anticipation. The porch, once a space of quiet reflection, was now a stage. He tried to move past them, but they crowded in, questions flying. His name had already traveled farther than he ever expected. He didn't speak. Inside, he placed the bag on the floor and sat in the old armchair by the window. The television on the kitchen counter flickered to life. A local news anchor was already reciting the timeline of his arrest, footage looping again, the handcuffs, the spill, the boy's frozen stare from across the street. The Bloomwood Times ran the headline by midday, "Christmas Mistake or Betrayal of Oath." The paper sold out before noon. Other papers called for interviews. Journalists combed through Harold's military record, discovering commendations he had never spoken of: 2 Bronze Stars, an Air Medal, a citation for valor during the Tet Offensive. Stories surfaced from men who remembered his leadership, his steadiness under fire. One described him as the kind of man who would carry others even if it broke him to do it. And here he was, arrested while trying to carry a few toys across the snow. In Washington, a congresswoman who had once served in the Air Force posted a message of support. Veteran groups across the country reshared the video. A retired general called the incident a quiet disgrace in plain sight. Hashtags turned into petitions. Calls flooded the mayor's office. Demands for an explanation mounted. At St. Clair's shelter, the staff realized with mounting horror what had happened. The new security guard had followed his instincts, but not the shelter's history. Photos of Harold delivering gifts from past years had adorned the break room for over a decade. He had always arrived quietly, left without a name. They had called him the December Man, a seasonal saint who came without fail. No one had connected him to the figure in the video, until now. The shelter released a statement. Then a correction. Then an apology. Inside his home, Harold remained silent. His phone rang. He did not answer. Letters began arriving by the hour, some hand-delivered. Veterans wrote to thank him. Strangers sent photos of their children holding gifts, holding signs, holding back tears. Artists began sketches of the image captured in the video, Harold in the snow, surrounded by scattered toys. One painting was sent from as far away as Oregon. By nightfall, Bloomwood had become the center of a national conversation. Yet in the quiet house on the hill, Harold sat as he always had, alone with his memories, his bag, and the quiet ache in his shoulder. The world had turned to face him, but he had not moved. The real pain was not the handcuffs. It was the knowledge that kindness, in the wrong light, had been mistaken for threat. Still, he thought of the children who waited at St. Clair. The toys hadn't made it. Their small joy had been postponed, if not lost. That, more than anything, weighed on him. That he had failed to deliver what he promised. But far away, in a bedroom lit by a phone screen, the boy who had filmed the video watched the rising numbers, millions of views now, and whispered the words aloud to no one in particular. People are going to remember him. And somewhere, that mattered. Spring arrived slowly in Bloomwood that year, as if the town itself was unsure how to move forward. Snow gave way to damp soil and hesitant crocuses, and the sidewalks once buried beneath frost now revealed children's chalk drawings and the occasional lost mitten. But beneath the surface, something deeper had shifted, a quiet turning of the town's heart. The boy who had filmed Harold's arrest was identified days after the video went viral. His name was Isaiah, 16 years old, living with his older sister just blocks from the shelter. Until then, few had noticed him. He was the type who moved through life quietly, head down, phone in hand. But the footage he had captured that night had changed not just Harold's life, but his own. The newly formed Bennett Fund, created in Harold's name by a coalition of veterans and local donors, announced its first scholarship in Isaiah's honor. The award would go to young people who chose to act when others stayed silent. Isaiah received the news with wide eyes and a stunned silence, unsure how to respond to attention he had never sought. But in the days that followed, his teachers noticed a change, his posture lifted, his gaze more direct. He had found, perhaps for the first time, that being a witness could carry weight and meaning. At the St. Clair shelter, the staff issued a formal apology and held a gathering to honor Harold's years of quiet service. They framed the original video, next to a new photograph taken of Harold months later, him sitting among the children, handing out toys with a soft smile. The photo bore a simple caption, now printed on brochures and murals alike: "Kindness doesn't ask to be seen, but it must never be forgotten." Meanwhile, Harold's surgery moved forward. His shoulder, long neglected and re-injured during the arrest, was finally treated. The community fund, now grown well beyond its original $100,000 goal, covered every medical expense, as well as a new workshop built behind Harold's house. There, with the help of modified tools designed for his mobility, he returned to his quiet craft of wooden toys. Each one bore a small emblem, hand-carved into the base, BTC. It stood for Bridge the Community, a phrase suggested by Isaiah himself. The toys were distributed not only to the St. Clair shelter, but to veteran housing centers, foster homes, and schools across the state. Each child who received one knew nothing of the arrest, but all knew the man who made them, because his story had become their story. Officer Zach Harris, placed on leave after the incident, enrolled in the department's newly instituted community training program. The new interim police chief, a retired Marine named Darius Long, implemented a monthly volunteer rotation for all officers, each assigned to spend 1 day per month in either a shelter, a senior home, or a veterans center. Participation was mandatory. Resistance was low. Something had been broken open, and not all breaks are wounds, some become windows. By early May, the Bloomwood Cemetery prepared for its annual Memorial Day service. For the first time in its history, the ceremony was not led solely by city officials, but by residents, teachers, shelter staff, and local veterans. The community had asked Harold to stand at the entrance alongside the former police chief, Ronald Gray, who had resigned the day after publicly accepting responsibility for Harold's treatment. Gray had not left town. Instead, he had quietly joined a volunteer group that maintained the headstones of fallen service members, his way of making peace in the most literal way he could. That morning, Harold stood beside him, each holding a basket of small flags. One by one, families passed through the gate. Mothers holding hands with daughters. Elderly couples in matching jackets. Teenagers who had come because their teachers asked them to. For each one, Harold offered a flag and a nod. No ceremony. Just a gesture. Some recognized him. Some paused to say thank you. Most simply took the flag and moved on, but their silence held weight, not ignorance. It was the silence of respect, of witness. When the last family passed, Harold sat down on the bench overlooking the field of stones. He looked at the horizon where the sun had begged in to warm the tips of the trees. In his coat pocket, Jason's old photograph rested beside the folded letter. His story had become part of something larger now, something he had never intended to build. But as he watched the children running between headstones, waving their flags, he saw what had grown from the frost of that night. It wasn't the fame that mattered. Not the money, or the headlines, or the apologies. It was the change. He had walked into the snow alone, bearing gifts for strangers, and been mistaken for a threat. But the children still received their toys. A town still changed. And now, others had taken up the weight. The final shift in the air wasn't loud. It came like breath on glass, like the soft thud of boots on old earth. But it stayed. And as Harold stood to leave, the flag in his hand fluttered once, then held steady in the wind. Kindness without question is enough.